Hi, everyone. My name is Ava. I go to school at UNC and I'm majoring in Spanish and Global Studies. And my travels have taken me to Spain, Cuba, and Costa Rica.
Hello, everyone. My name's Sammie. I'm from a small town in near Winston-Salem called Knoxville. I'm a global studies and management society major, and I've been able to travel to Tunisia and El Salvador, and I'm also trilingual.
So these are the two places that we will be talking about today. And so, as you can see, we're in the US and Cuba is right below us, and then El Salvador is below that. So we have a few questions if you want to, just as an introduction. So, because we're talking about transportation, what types of transportation do you guys use the most? Um,
The majority of the answers were car. We had some people that also do some biking and some walking. And I'll do the next poll.
yeah, so the next question is, have you ever been on a plane, a boat, both, or neither?
So again, you can kind of do the average of your classroom if you're together as a class. Looks like we got some, well, overall, we have 4 out of 4 people said both for some of their students. Some said, one person said a plane, one said a boat, one said neither. So you got a little bit of a mix.
All right, so transportation in El Salvador. I'm gonna start off with this little chart. So there's a lot of ways to see transportation in El Salvador. We're going to talk a little bit about each one, but this is just a general idea of where it starts. All right, so very first one is bikes. A lot of people like to, if they're it's a local thing, they will just, take their bike and quickly go down the street to buy, necessary goods. But a lot of that is because cars are more expensive in El Salvador, especially if they're foreign cars. So it's very environmental friendly, customized in the sense that sometimes they will also like add baskets in the front so they can carry their goods. And then as you see in the picture, they will add like a little extension so they can also transport more people. And the second common transport means of transportation is motorcycles. This actually is very useful, especially since a lot of roads in El Salvador are not paved. It's easier to get into those rural areas and also be able to get there in a timely fashion. It's very reliable, it's not as expensive, and also it's used for small businesses. An example is at my uncle's house, there would always be someone in the morning who came and sold bread. And so they would just carry it in the back. But it's various different businesses that do this. And so the buses are a little different from what we have here. They specifically only have 3 stops. And so as you can see in the picture, it says Santana and then San Salvador and then Directo. These are 3 different cities they go to. And so based on where you're going, you could pay like the first city if it's close, 50 cents. If you're going to the capital, it could be $1. It depends on where you're from. Usually, they'll ask you to pay once you're on the bus and it starts moving. They are COVID. They are watching out for COVID, so they are requiring masks before you board. But it's a very efficient way to go and move around in El Salvador. And so then we have the moto taxi. These are very common in smaller towns. They're not exactly loud in like bigger cities. They are a bit pricier because it is a farther route to get to any other location. They are small, so you can usually only fit 3 people. If you have small children, they will like let them sit on their laps. And so maybe I want to say 5, but it's a very tiny space. but it's a way for them to kind of move around if they have limited transportation. And then we have taxis. So taxis are very accessible. Prices just vary depending on the driver and if it's a privately owned or a company owned taxi. Usually you just gotta like, stick your hand out and like get their attention and they'll come and you just gotta give like a general gist of where you're going. But definitely that was the number one means of transportation in the city. And then there's privately owned taxis. So usually that's someone who it could be like a family member or a family friend. They do have like different car models. As an example, it could be new, it could be old. And it is a bit cheaper because there's more trust within the driver and the person going around. And so, for example, they can give a taxi rate could be like $3 and they could charge you only like $2. It's a little bit more cheaper, but definitely common in the markets. And then we have car rentals. Car rentals are actually very popular in El Salvador. They used to be a bit more expensive, but now there's people doing like private businesses where you could rent a car for a day for $25. Obviously, with like the year, make, and model, it'll be more expensive, but at most, I think it was around $80. So I have a question for you all. What type of transportation would you like to try if you ever visited El Salvador?
So you can put your answers in the chat. So some of the ones that Sammie mentioned, Sammie, you can review them if you want.
Yeah, so we have bikes, motorcycles, mototaxi, buses, and then taxis. There's private taxis, and then there's regular taxis.
I see 3 that said the moto taxi seems fun. So that's something different that we don't really have here. Someone else said they want to try a motorcycle. Good. All right, so we'll move on to transportation in Cuba and show you some other transportation options if you were to visit there.
So the first mode of transportation that's super common in Cuba is the BC taxi. So it's a bike and it seats 2 people. And many tourists use it as a way to get around the city and also get to view the city. And they do different tours where you can ride around and kind of get a history of the city and of Cuba while sitting and riding. And so it's a good way to get around within the city. And it is a good form of transport because when there was a lack of fuel, it's a resourceful way to get around without having to use any gas.
Since we have our delay with YouTube, I see some people that are watching from YouTube said they wanted to try the moto taxi and the bikes. All right, go ahead, Ava.
So this is another form of transportation called the Coco taxi, which is similar to the BC taxi. And there's 2 types. There's one that's yellow, which is for tourists, and then there's one that's black that is specifically for Cubans. And they're cheaper than other taxis and good to travel short distances. So guaguas are what Cubans call the public buses. And they are usually pretty crowded. As you can see, a bunch of people getting on. It looks like a bunch of students. And there's normally long lines to wait for these buses, and they don't have air conditioning. And they cost about 1 Cuban peso, which is 4 cents. So this is similar to the buses, but it's like they're like microbuses called taxiruteros, and they follow a route around the city, and they're generally cheaper than other forms of taxis. They cost around 10 Cuban pesos, which is 40 cents, and they're less crowded than the guaguas, but more expensive than the buses. So then there's intercity buses. There's 3 different types. Via Azul is specifically for tourists to get from one city to another, so they go across Cuba. And Transvia Gota is specifically for just Cubans to take in between cities. But these are nicer. And then there's the Havana Bay Ferry. So this ferry leaves from Old Havana Port and goes across the bay to the 2 different villages that are across. And it's a great way to see the water and to get to these different parts of Havana. So almendrones are the old Cuban cars that are been made into taxis. So they're privately owned, and boteros are the individuals that drive these taxis, and they get to create their own schedule, which is different than in the U.S. And they make a decent amount of money, which is like probably like 1,000 US dollars a month. And that allows them to fix up these really cool old cars. And so they have shared taxis have a fixed route, and they're most common in Havana and Santiago de Cuba, which are 2 cities within Cuba. Yeah. And this is another picture of them. And so just like how Sammie mentioned in El Salvador, biking is also a common way to get around, and it's environmentally friendly. And we see bikes here all the time too. So that's something that we all have in common. And then hitchhiking gained popularity when there was a gasoline shortage in Cuba, like I had mentioned before, with the BC taxi. And so it actually was required for a short time that cars or people who were able to drive would pick up hitchhikers if they saw them. So it was required by the government to help people out with transportation. And it's no longer required, but many times hitchhikers, that's still a way that a lot of people get around. And Cubans refer to hitchhikers as ir con la botella, which is translated to going with the bottle. So what kinds of transportation would you like to try if you were ever going to Cuba?
So we already had one person that said earlier that the Coco taxi looks super fun. So we'll see what else we get. Another one that they want to try the Coco taxi. That one has a fun name too. Someone else said the antique Cuban cars. And I believe the reason for that, Ava, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was that there were not very many imports to Cuba for a long time. So they continued to kind of revitalize the old cars and keep them going.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Let's see if we have nothing from YouTube yet, but they'll probably be a little bit behind. Good. Thank you guys for sharing which ones you'd like to try. There's a lot of good options. All right, so now we're going to check in and see what you guys remember. So I will pull up the polls. Next one.
So the first question is, what kind of taxis can you find in both Cuba and El Salvador?
They might have had slightly different names, but they're the similar kind of transportation. All right, so we had a tie between Moto Taxi and BC Taxi, so you guys can let them know which one it was, or if there was multiple answers.
Yeah, pretty much they both have similar ones. I will say Moto Taxi is more common. BC is more for Cuba. But yeah, you can say both.
They both had different. So the Coco Taxi is kind of a type of Moto Taxi, correct? Yeah, so they just had a little bit of a different name. Good. All right, let's do the next one. So in El Salvador, how many cities does the bus travel to? So I'll pull up the poll. I think everyone got that right. It was 3, right, Sammie? Good. Okay, let's try the next one. So, in which country can you find the Havana Bay Ferry? In Cuba or in El Salvador? All right, looks like you guys got this one too. You had Cuba. And then in YouTube, they got the last one correct as well. They had 3 for the bus stops in El Salvador. So now we're going to take questions. And so first, if you guys want, you can ask us any questions in the chat that you might have about transportation in Cuba or El Salvador. And then after that, we'll take any questions you have just about those countries in general. So you could ask us about food or clothing or music or dance, or you can ask us about Sammie, and you can ask Sammie and Ava about their experiences when they have been to those countries. So feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. All right, so we have a question. The first one is a little bit about how politics work in El Salvador and Cuba. And actually, that's something we're going to talk about for Cuba at our presentation later at 1 o'clock today. So if you want to learn more about that, you can join us then. But if you guys want to give us a little bit of information about politics or government in El Salvador and Cuba. Whoever wants to go first, feel free.
I guess I can go first. So politics in El Salvador is not similar to Cuba. It's a bit different. I feel like right now it's democratic in the sense. There is a new president, so it definitely is changing. His name's Nayib Bukele. This president right now is currently really working on improving like the economy and everything. They're actually, since like the last time I visited, which was about 6 years ago, there's definitely been a lot more work on just making sure, one, there's for education, he's been providing laptops to students who have to go to school virtually. Roads are definitely being improved. There's so much more like improvement in that, and means of transportation. Especially with COVID, there was definitely a lot more hospitals built. Um, but yeah, it's a bit different in terms of that, but definitely it's still changing.
And in Cuba, it's a communist country, so it's a one-party system. And right now, the president is Raúl Castro, but he basically was given office, so not elected. And because it's a communist country, there is like they have had different periods where they have not had different like contact with countries, so that's one of the reasons why the cars are so old there, because getting imports from certain places is tricky at times.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions about transportation. One says, how old do you have to be to take the Coco Taxi? And one is, why is the Coco Taxi shaped the way it is? So I don't know if there's any restrictions on age, or if you know those, Ava.
I don't actually know. I know that a lot of times, like the people who drive the Coco taxis, that's what they do for a living, so that's their job. I don't know if there is an age restriction though. And for the shape of them, they're called Coco taxis because they kind of look like half a coconut. But I don't know the reason for how they came up with that design.
Yeah, I would guess there's probably not an age restriction, but that's a good question. Someone from YouTube said, "Are the bus drivers able to take breaks when they get hungry?" I don't know if you would know that or not, either of you. But did you notice anybody like changing shifts when you were on the bus? Different people taking over?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I actually didn't ride the public bus, the guaguas in Cuba, just because they're so crowded that like getting around, it was easier to walk or take the BC taxi. But I assume that like how buses work here, you know, that a lot of bus drivers have like lunch or like bags with them, and they're able to like stop and eat, along the route. So maybe that's how it works in Cuba. I'm not sure.
Yeah, in El Salvador, it's kind of there's no set schedule. Each bus is pretty much their driver is gonna stay there all day. The buses in El Salvador run from like 4 a.m. till 7 p.m. So pretty much when they stop for gas, they will get off and stretch, take a break. But also when they make stops like near the city, there are people, vendors who come on the bus and will sell food and different items. So sometimes they will buy food from them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a long shift, so that's good that there's some vendors. Maybe they can at least get a snack. Let's see. Another question: are there school buses or specific transportation for them? So school buses in addition to the public city buses, or how do kids usually get to school?
In El Salvador, so it depends where the school's located. Most likely, if it's someone who's going to like elementary school over there or middle school, the school will be locally like within their neighborhoods. And so usually they walk. They will usually take, someone, a family member, someone older, just because it is unsafe to go by yourself. Um, Buses they can take. There are children who take it at a very young age. But usually that's only if like they're at a private school that's a bit farther out. And then some people bike.
Yeah, it's similar in Cuba, and they actually repurposed old school buses because they had because the transportation because like the guaguas get so crowded, they repurposed the school buses as forms of public transportation too. So like those are they if you like see one around, it's most likely a bus for anyone to use, not just kids going to school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the U.S., typically a lot of students take just the school bus, but in some other countries, students will also take public transportation as well. Good questions. Another question: how long is a bus ride normally to go from a rural area to a city? So maybe you guys can just tell us a little bit about maybe the breakdown of how big the rural areas are in your countries versus the cities, or an example of the distance between maybe one big city and one rural area that you traveled to.
Yeah. So my dad's from like closer to the city, and then my mom's from a very rural area. So I got to experience the bus ride from both locations. From where my mom is, she's about 30 minutes away from the city. So on the bus, I would say it took about 45 minutes because in between when you're picking up different people, they do stop and wait because you never know who needs to go to the city. And then from where my dad is, which is about 7 minutes from the city, it did take about 15 minutes to get to like the main center.
So in Cuba, it really just depends on where you're going. Like outside of Havana, there's like different towns that you can go, like beach towns. And that was probably like a 30-minute bus ride. But if you're going to like going farther in to the country, it could be really anywhere from like a couple hours to I don't know how long it takes to get across the country. But the Havana and Santiago de Cuba are on opposite sides. So I would imagine that it would be a fairly long bus ride.
Good. And someone asked if Coco taxis have doors at the side. So are there doors, or you just step right in?
You just step right in.
Good. All right. Let's see. All right. Another question are: what are some of the popular foods in Cuba and El Salvador? Or some of the foods that maybe you liked while you were there?
I think for me, it was definitely, even though we have it here, we're pupusas, because in El Salvador, it's so much cheaper. For three pupusas, you only had to pay $1. In the US, you pay about $3 just for one. So definitely that was very popular, easy to find. And then we have um, a different type of ice cream there. Um, and to explain it, it's pretty much like a cherry flavor, and then they put two different sauces, which is like a red and a black one. It's very sweet, but it's very common in the markets. I'm forgetting the name right now, but it'll come back to me. But that's pretty much like two of the main things people go for in the markets.
And in Cuba, I ate a bunch of rice and beans, which is pretty common, and plantains also. And they have two different ways of cooking them. So they like cut them up into like small circles, almost like chips. And you can when they're ripe, they're called maduros, and they're kind of sweet. They taste a little bit like bananas. And when they're not ripe, when the plantains are green, they're called tostones, and they're a little bit tougher. And it's like a more savory thing. And then I also learned how to make ropa vieja, which is a like shredded beef dish.
Yeah, and depending where you guys live, if you ever come to the Triangle area, I know you can get pupusas places in Raleigh, maybe also in Chapel Hill. I think there's a Cuban restaurant, maybe also in Raleigh. There's lots of places that have tostones around here. That's one of my favorites. Also, I love pupusas too. You guys are making me hungry. All right, another person asked, what are some of the transportation problems they have? Do they have any problems with transportation?
I think the biggest problem is traffic because especially if it's a bus, they cannot get through sometimes. And like with motorcycles, they can just weave their way through. And also just the way like the paved roads are not as even as we have it here in the US. So that definitely has always caused the reason for the traffic, and just most of the roads are just a single lane, and then there's not much of a regulation on how fast you can go on the road, and so drivers over there have to be very precautious in how they go about getting from place to place.
And in Cuba, there is just not as much like there's kind of like there's a lot of the public transportation gets really crowded, especially the buses. So that is a problem. So that's like why they have been repurposing other vehicles to become to function for like public transportation and take people around. Yeah.
Someone said if there's a limit on how long you can get a BC taxi ride for, so I would imagine that they would get tired after a little while. But are they usually short distances or minimum?
Yeah, so it's yeah, just to kind of get around the city, but even like getting around the city, like you couldn't ride for I like the driver would get tired probably around an hour. And that would also like get more expensive. They'll charge you more if you're asking to go long distances. And I think there's like some people will do it. But it generally depends on like how much they want to work because it can get pretty strenuous because they're carrying two people around.
There's another question of if you both have driver's licenses, and maybe you could also talk about if you know the age that it is to have a driver's license in El Salvador or Cuba, or how common it is to have a driver's license there. So you can talk about what you have here and maybe a little bit about there as well.
I don't know exactly the age restriction. I would assume it's 18. There is a thing that, I mean, the regulation is that you have to have a license, obviously, but a lot of people don't, if they're younger, they don't use them. It's just they only travel locally. Also, what they call their license is like a DUI. So you have to go to a certain office, just like here, like a DMV, to get that. But yeah, they require that, and also just to make sure police do have license checks usually. So that's been a way to kind of incentivize that everyone make sure that they have everything together.
Yeah, in Cuba, the age for driving is 18. But I don't know like how I don't know the process of getting a driver's license.
Yeah, in most other countries, to drive a car, it's 18. The US is pretty unique in 16, but in some other countries, you can get like a license to drive a motorcycle or a moped at a younger age before 18, but it depends on the country. But yeah, good question. We had another question about food. What foods are commonly grown in Cuba? And someone said, isn't it very sandy? If they can't grow foods, where do they get their food? So maybe you can talk about some of the foods that they can grow easily there.
Yeah, so they had a huge sugarcane industry, and that's how a lot of that was their uh, source of like exports. So that was definitely like really beneficial in terms of like their economy. And so, but you can't obviously survive off of sugarcane, so they had to import a bunch, and that is also because importing to Cuba, it being a communist country, isn't always easy, and so they have had different, waves of food shortages. So sometimes it's hard to get certain foods, but I remember when I was there eating a lot of fresh fruit every morning. So that's something that, because of the it being a more tropical location, that they're able to um, grow lots of fruit.
Yeah, so lots of fresh food. That's great. Someone asked, what side of the road do they drive on in Cuba and El Salvador? The same as the United States or different?
Yeah, it's the same in Cuba.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yep. All right, great questions, you guys. I think we've answered all the questions there are so far. Feel free to type more questions in. And while we're waiting for more questions, if you guys want, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your focus countries, of when you've been there, why you've been there, while we're waiting for some more questions to come in.
For me specifically, my family's from El Salvador. I actually was there this past month. I just got back. Also, I did want to add a fact because I think a lot of people don't know this. In El Salvador, they do use the U.S. dollar. I have one of these coins, but I don't think we use these a lot in North Carolina, the $1 coins. But these are very popular in El Salvador. Very common to use this and up to like $20 bills. Um, but yeah, I went to visit family. That's pretty much main reasons I go. And just kind of stay and just learn about my history and culture just in general. It's a little bit, different experience because you get to see a different community and also practice, your language skills, as it's very different than the formal Spanish we're taught in classrooms. You have to learn a lot of the slang words, and also people tend to speak very fast, so they'll immediately know you're not from there once you start speaking in Spanish, due to accents. But yeah, that's been the main reasons why I've been there.
And Ava?
I went to Cuba, I think it was 3 years ago, and I was volunteering with a program called Globalware. So, like, going to Cuba, I had to say that I was volunteering there, and then once I got to Cuba, they have like a restriction on how much you're able to volunteer, and so I actually had to say that I was a tourist when I entered the country. Um, but yeah, so I volunteered with this program, and we were able to plant agriculture in the actually town called Casablanca, across from the bay, across from Havana, and it's a area that is really susceptible to erosion. So by planting all of these plants, it basically allowed for the village to not get eroded more when anytime that it rained, or there was a big storm, and it also provided like a source of food for them. So I helped out with that, and then I also got to go to they have multiple places where old people live, like a retirement home. And I got to learn how to play dominoes, which is a common pastime in Cuba. And so there's like a bunch of different homes in different parts of the city, and they actually have a dominoes competition a couple times a year. And so the one that I went to, they had just won the competition. So that was really cool to be able to learn how to play that, and they are very passionate about it.
Yeah, in the streets, I know that you can see people playing dominoes. We also, I don't know if you guys that are watching have ever borrowed our culture kits, but if you want to learn more about El Salvador and Cuba, we do have culture kits, which are bags of items from those countries. We're not taking any new reservations for this year, but we'll start taking reservations for next fall in August. And I know there's some dominoes in the Cuba kit, so you could learn how to play that in some of our other Caribbean kits as well. All right, we've got more questions, lots of questions. Let's see. Is Cuba able to import more luxury goods like makeup, or are there also not as many imports on other items in addition to food that you know of, Ava?
I'm not exactly sure. I know that it is becoming more common to have imports, and they also are getting more European companies to establish like stores there. So in some of the newer plazas, they have like more like common name brand stores, so that's becoming more common.
They're also curious how old each of you are.
I'm 19.
I'm 22.
Yeah, so Ava is a sophomore at UNC, and Sammie is a senior, so she's her last year. I have a question about what is the currency in Cuba. So we learned that the currency in El Salvador is the same as the US dollar, but in Cuba, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's CUCs, CUCs, and then there's also the Cuban peso. So when I went, I had to like exchange US dollars for CUCs. But then a lot of the Cubans use the peso. So
They also want to know what the colors are of the Cuban flag and the El Salvador flag, and if you happen to know the meaning of the colors, you can tell us, but if not, you can just tell us maybe what the flags look like.
For El Salvador, it's just blue, white, and then there's more meaning between the little school that's in the middle, the center part. El Salvador is mainly built on like about like 5 major volcanoes, which sounds very dangerous. And I mean, some of them are active. They just fortunately have not erupted, but they put 5 of them in a line, and then the island, and then the water and all to kind of like signify like the peace. Because in translation, El Salvador is the savior. So I think the white's peace. I can't remember exactly what the blue is, but it's in the lines between like bravery. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
in Cuba, the flag is blue, white, and red, and it's like stripes, blue and white stripes, and then there's like a triangle that's red with a star on one side. And so I think the blue stripes refer to the 3 old divisions of the island, and then the red triangle stands for equality. But I don't know about the white.
Okay, good. Um, are there seat belts in the Coco taxi or in the Moto taxi also in El Salvador? Are there seat belts?
There aren't in Cuba.
No. And Sammie?
Yeah, I think seatbelts are just not really used at all, even if they are there.
Not as strict as we are here. All right. Let's see. They asked, do kids have time to play games and have recess? So I don't know if you guys know any younger kids or got to meet any younger kids. If you learned anything about recess while you were there.
From what I understood, because my cousins right now, they just started opening up schools this past week. They said they had a dedicated time for recess, but it was still labeled as PE from what I got. That's pretty much all I know.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to get to talk to many kids when I was in Cuba, so I don't know what their school looks like.
Yeah, we'll have to. That's a good question for Jake. I think he worked in a school while he was there. He's presenting on Cuba at 1 p.m. I know that they typically wear school uniforms.
Yeah.
In Cuba a lot. That's one thing I do know about their school system. What religions are common? And can you find Hindu temples or mosques at all? So in both countries, what are some of the common religions and different places of worship you might have seen while you were there?
I think for El Salvador, majority are Catholic. There are different types of Protestant churches, but I don't. I do think we have like a small community, maybe of like Jewish individuals, because I did see a lot of signs, but I'm not 100% sure about other religions. It might be common maybe in like the capital where there's a little bit more different cultures there.
Yeah, I'm also not sure about other religions, but Christianity, specifically Catholicism, is also the primary religion practiced in Cuba.
Good. Are there so it says have you ever seen, well, is it common to fall out of a Coco taxi or a Moto taxi since there's no seat belts? Do they go very fast, or is it feel pretty secure? What do you guys think?
It feels pretty secure. Yeah, I think that if people were falling out of them a lot, then they probably would have better seatbelts.
Yeah.
I think it might have happened, but that's the whole reason between like riding at your own risk. But usually, I mean, they're very precautious unless you really have to be somewhere. it might be just someone, it's a bump and, stuff
Yeah,
like that.
they're pretty good. All right, you guys have so many good questions. This is great. Hopefully you're learning some new things. I think that's all the questions that we've had so far. If you guys have any additional questions, you can add them in. We'll wait a couple more minutes, and if not, we might wrap things up, but feel free if there's anything else you want to know about Cuba or El Salvador, now's your chance. All right, I think that's all the questions. So thank you so much, Sammie and Ava, for teaching about transportation today and for asking the questions. And thank you to all the classes that joined us for your participation during the presentation and all your great questions after the presentation.